Do you want to sleep? Then listen to me. Turn off the lights, close the windows, now close them and listen to you. Finally, I will make a request to you. Put down your phone and listen to my voice. Listen clearly. I will now tell you a story that will make you sleepy. Close your eyes and listen carefully to my words.
Alice was feeling wonderfully lazy that warm afternoon. The sky above her glowed a perfect soft blue. The grass felt like a cool cushion beneath her, and the gentle breeze played with the ends of her hair. Her sister sat beside her, reading a book filled with lessons and lines and paragraphs Alice did not care for at all. It had no pictures, no conversations, just words marching in rows like ants. Alice sighed, a long, dreamy sigh. That was when she saw it. A rabbit, a white rabbit, trotting quickly across the meadow. Nothing strange about that, except this rabbit wore a neat little waistcoat and carried a pocket watch. And as it hurried by, it muttered, oh dear, I shall be very late." Alice sat upright so fast that the world seemed to wobble. A talking rabbit was interesting enough, but a rabbit checking the time? That was irresistible. Without a second thought, not one, she dashed after it. The rabbit slipped through a hedge and disappeared into a wide rabbit hole beneath the roots of an old tree. Alice leaned over the edge, trying to spot it. And suddenly, the ground gave way. Alice tumbled downward in a slow, drifting fall, as though she had been caught in a great, gentle whirlpool of air. No panic, no terror, only a floating feeling, almost like sinking into a dream. Around her, the walls of the tunnel weren't walls at all, but shelves filled with books, jars, maps, and odd little trinkets, like someone had turned a rabbit's burrow into a cozy library. As she drifted past them, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her, like the world was welcoming her into a secret. Down, down, down she fell. She began to wonder if she might drift forever like a leaf in a deep well of air. But just as her thoughts became sleepy and warm, she landed gently on a soft mound of leaves. The white rabbit hurried along a hallway ahead, still muttering, still checking his watch. Alice brushed herself off, smoothed her dress, and followed him once more into a place she could not have imagined. A long corridor with tiny doors, dozens of them, all locked. And so began Alice's journey into a world where nothing was quite what it seemed, and everything felt like a strange, wonderful dream. Alice tumbled down, 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 until at last she landed, rather softly to her surprise, on a long hallway lined with tiny doors. After her strange adventure with the white rabbit and that curious bottle labeled "Drink Me," something peculiarly magical began to happen. Alice felt her body stretching upwards, higher, much higher. "Oh dear," she whispered as the ceiling inched closer to her head. "This must be what telescopes feel like." In a matter of moments, she was grown so tall that her head nearly brushed the chandelier. She tried to reach for the tiny golden key on the table, the one that fit the little door to the lovely garden, but her long arms could not reach properly, and she only managed to knock it over. This made her feel terribly frustrated, and when Alice felt frustrated, she sometimes cried. Only this time, her tears were giant tears. They splashed onto the floor like raindrops falling from clouds, forming a shimmering, salty puddle around her shoes. The more she worried, the more she cried, until the puddle grew into a small lake, a whole pool swirling beneath her. "Oh, Alice," she scolded herself gently, "you really must stop this at once." And as soon as she said it, something curious happened again. She shrank and shrank until she was no taller than a mouse. Now the key was far above her, and the pool of tears, her own, was suddenly enormous and frightening. She began to float in it, paddling as best she could. A little splashing noise caught her attention. A mouse, gray-furred and whiskered, was swimming beside her. "Oh, hello," Alice said politely, treading water. "Do you happen to know the way to dry land?" The mouse regarded her with a solemn expression. "Perhaps," it squeaked, "but first tell me, why are you swimming in your own tears?" Alice felt her cheeks warm. "Well, I suppose I was a bit upset." "A bit?" said the mouse, sniffing. "This pool is quite excessive." Alice tried to laugh, though it came out in a tiny bubble. "I do apologize. I didn't mean to create such a flood." Together they floated, drifting gently toward the low-lit edge of the hall where the pool lapped at the floor tiles. Other little creatures, ducks, dodos, lizards, soon joined them, splashing and shaking water from feathers and tails. It was a most unusual gathering, but in Wonderland, unusual things were just the beginning. With a soft sigh and a small smile, Alice followed the mouse toward dry ground, wondering what strange and marvelous creatures she would meet next. The crowd of strange creatures, birds, animals, and Alice stood dripping wet on the riverbank. Everyone shivered, feathers drooping, fur soaked through. The dodo, who seemed to consider himself something of a leader, cleared his throat loudly. "The best thing to dry us off," he announced, "is a caucus race." No one had the faintest idea what that was, not even the dodo himself, but the creatures nodded as if it were perfectly obvious. Alice watched, puzzled, as the dodo drew a large, wobbly circle in the sand. Well, mostly a circle, more like a potato shape. "Everybody line up wherever you like," he declared. There was no starting line, no finish line, and certainly no rules. The creatures wandered into the circle at random, standing wherever they pleased. "When I say go," the dodo said, but he never finished the sentence because everyone had already begun running, if you could call it running. Some trotted, some hopped, others simply wandered in confused loops. They went around and around, splashing sand, bumping into one another, gasping for breath. Alice followed politely, though she had absolutely no idea what she was supposed to be doing. After a long, chaotic while, the dodo suddenly shouted, "The race is over!" Everyone stopped at once. "But who won?" Alice asked. The dodo paused dramatically, puffed out his chest, and proclaimed, "Everybody has won, and all must have prizes." This sounded very generous, until each creature turned expectantly toward Alice. She blinked. "Prizes?" The dodo nodded solemnly. Alice checked her pockets and found a tiny box of sweets she had stashed earlier. With a sigh, she handed one out to every damp creature. They accepted with great ceremony, bowing as if receiving medals. Then the dodo stepped forward, expecting something more. Alice puzzled over this. I don't have anything left." The dodo thought deeply. "Your thimble," he commanded. Alice handed it over. The dodo returned it with a grand speech. "We beg your acceptance of this magnificent thimble." The creatures clapped politely. Alice took back her own thimble, feeling that this was all rather silly. but also strangely amusing. As everyone munched on sweets, the mouse climbed onto a stone, tail curled like a question mark. "You promised to tell us your story," Alice said kindly. "Why you hate cats and dogs so much?" The mouse sighed dramatically and began. "Mine is a long and sad tale." Alice glanced at the mouse's thin, curling tail and couldn't help giggling. "But it is a long tail," she said. The mouse bristled. "I said tail, not tail!" He launched into a gloomy poem, the words bending and twisting downward in the very shape of his tail itself. Alice tried hard to follow, but the story wound so tightly and strangely that she soon lost track. When she finally interrupted with a question, the mouse squeaked angrily, "You're not listening, not one bit!" And with that, he scurried away into the grass. Alice hurried after him, apologizing, but the rest of the creatures drifted off, squabbling about the race and licking the last crumbs of their sweets. Soon Alice found herself alone again, standing in the quiet, curious world of Wonderland, wondering what could possibly happen next. The rabbit sends in a little bill. Alice tumbled and bounced through the long, twisting rabbit hole passage, and at last she landed gently on a bed of dry leaves. She sat up slowly, brushing dust from her dress, when the familiar patter of hurried footsteps echoed behind her. It was the White Rabbit, fussing as always. "Oh, my poor paws! Oh, my fur and whiskers!" he cried. Without even noticing Alice, he rushed forward in a panic. "I'm late, and the Duchess will be furious! Wherever did I drop my gloves?" Alice, feeling a little braver now, stood and said softly, "If you're looking for gloves, perhaps I can help you find them." But the rabbit spun around so suddenly that Alice took a step back. "Marianne, what are you doing out here? Run home this instant and fetch me a pair of gloves and a fan. Hurry!" Before Alice could explain that her name was not Marianne, the rabbit shoved her toward a neat little cottage nearby. "Well, I suppose I'd better," Alice sighed, not wanting to upset him further. Inside the rabbit's little house, the cottage was surprisingly cozy. Small furniture, soft cushions, little shelves lined with tiny boots. Alice found a fan and several pairs of gloves, just where she imagined they might be. But something else caught her attention. A beautiful glass bottle glowing gently on a table. She absolutely knew this was a very bad idea. But curiosity tugged her whisper soft like a lullaby. She lifted the bottle, hesitated, and took a sip. In moments, Alice felt her feet pressing against the floor. Her head bumped the ceiling. Her arms filled the room like branches of a growing tree. "Oh no, not again," she murmured with a sigh. Soon she was wedged tightly inside the rabbit's house, unable to move at all. The walls creaked, the floor trembled. Outside, she heard the rabbit exclaim, "Marianne, what are you doing in there? Come out at once!" Alice wished she could. But she was stuck, quite stuck. The rabbit panicked. He ran around outside, calling for help. "Bill!" he shouted to a small lizard holding a ladder. "Climb down the chimney and get her out!" Alice felt the brush of soot near her shoulders and gave one firm little kick. Whoosh! Poor Bill shot out of the chimney like a cork from a bottle, spiraling into the sky. The rabbit gasped. A crowd gathered. Someone suggested burning the house down. This was extra alarming. Alice, now frightened and desperate, spotted small cakes scattered near her enormous hand. With no other option, she nibbled one. Instantly, she shrank, smaller and smaller, until she slipped free from the house entirely. She dashed away through the grass, leaving the rabbit and the startled animals behind. As the cool forest shadows wrapped around her, Alice stopped to catch her breath. She was small again. Small, confused, but filled with an even deeper sense of wonder. And she continued on, deeper into the dreamlike world ahead.
The forest around Alice grew still and warm as she wandered deeper beneath the tall, whispering leaves. She had only just stopped crying when she noticed something curious. A large mushroom, perfectly round, like a pale umbrella rising from the mossy ground. But it was what sat on top of the mushroom that made her blink twice. A blue caterpillar, no bigger than her hand, lounged along the edge of the cap as though it were the most comfortable sofa in the world. He was smoking a long, elegant hookah, sending rings of scented smoke drifting into the air. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, in a slow, thoughtful voice, the caterpillar asked, "Who are you?" Alice opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure anymore. I hardly know, sir," she admitted. "I've been so many sizes today that I hardly know who I am." The caterpillar blinked at her, unimpressed. "Explain yourself." Alice tried, but the more she talked, the more confused she became. The caterpillar simply watched her with half-lidded eyes, as though nothing she said could possibly matter. When she finished, he took one last puff and said, "You'll get used to it." Alice wasn't satisfied. "But I don't want to keep changing sizes." The caterpillar considered this, then finally offered something like advice. He pointed one tiny arm toward the mushroom. "One side will make you grow taller," he said. "The other will make you grow shorter." Alice looked at the mushroom. "But which side is which?" The caterpillar didn't answer. Instead, he slid gracefully off the mushroom and crawled away into the woods, saying only, "Keep your temper." And then he was gone. Left alone, Alice broke off 2 little pieces of the mushroom, one from the right side, one from the left. She tucked them carefully into her pockets. "Well," she said, taking a tiny nibble from one piece. At once, her neck stretched upward like a telescope, her head rising high above the trees. The leaves brushed her face, and a startled bird screeched at her, thinking she was some kind of serpent. Alice panicked and quickly bit into the other piece. Down she shrank, too far, far too small. Nibble, nibble, grow, shrink, grow, shrink. At last she managed to bring herself back to a comfortable size again. She sighed with relief, smoothing her dress. With the mushroom pieces safely tucked away, she walked deeper into the forest, not knowing what strange creature or curious adventure would be waiting for her next.
Pig and Pepper, bedtime version. The forest around Alice had grown unusually quiet, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She walked along a winding path, wondering where it might lead, when suddenly a tiny house appeared through the leaves. It looked as if it were balancing awkwardly on tiptoes, leaning slightly to one side, with a tall chimney puffing curls of violet-colored smoke into the sky. As Alice approached, she heard the strangest sound. A sneeze, then another, and then a very loud squeal. Curious as ever, Alice stepped onto the porch and knocked. The door flew open, and a fish wearing a footman's uniform bowed stiffly. "Come in," he said in a voice that sounded exactly like a bubble popping. Alice entered and instantly understood the sneezing. Pepper everywhere. The entire kitchen looked like a storm of pepper had swept through it. It floated in the air in shimmering clouds, settled on the tables, and made her eyes water. In the middle of the room, the Duchess sat with a baby in her arms, rocking it violently as it wailed and howled. The cook, an enormous woman with a glare sharp enough to cut bread, was dumping handfuls of pepper into a gigantic pot of soup. Each pinch sent the baby into a fresh round of screeching. Alice cleared her throat. "Excuse me, would you mind?" "Sneeze!" She couldn't even finish her sentence. The Duchess didn't seem to notice. "Everyone minds," the Duchess said suddenly, "but I don't. Too busy." She shook the baby again, as if trying to untangle it. Alice, growing more concerned by the second, watched the cook throw in even more pepper. Spices flew through the air like sparks. "I wish they wouldn't sneeze so much," Alice said softly. "Then don't stand there," snapped the Duchess. "Do something useful. Recite something." Before Alice could reply, the baby let out an enormous wail. The Duchess thrust it into Alice's arms. "Take it outside. It's bothering me." She stared down at the little creature. Its nose was snout-like, its ears strangely floppy, and every time it squeaked, it sounded less like a baby and more like a pig. She hurried outside, hoping the fresh air might help. The pepper mist thinned behind her, and the trees rustled gently. She looked back at the baby. It snorted, then wriggled, then, quite suddenly, turned into a small pink piglet. "Well," Alice sighed, setting it gently onto the ground, "if you're going to be a pig, you may as well enjoy it." The piglet trotted happily into the forest. Alice wiped the pepper from her eyes and continued along the path, wondering what strange creature might greet her next. And as if the world had heard her thoughts, a shape shimmered above a low tree branch. A grin. A floating, glowing grin. The rest of the creature slowly appeared in soft pieces, whiskers, ears, and finally the whole body of the famous Cheshire Cat, whose wide smile seemed to hold a secret of its own. Alice blinked up at it. The cat blinked back upside down. And so a new chapter of Wonderland trouble was about to begin.
Alice wandered along the forest path, feeling quite sure she was lost again, when she noticed a table, an extraordinarily long, mismatched table spread out under a tree. Teacups, teapots, crumbs, and spoons were scattered everywhere, as though the table had been hosting a tea party for months without pause. At one end sat the March Hare. Beside him, leaning strangely over his chair, was the Mad Hatter, wearing a very large hat with a price tag still stuck in it. Between them slept the Dormouse, curled like a tiny furry pebble in a teapot. They all looked up when they saw Alice. "No room!" the Hatter shouted instantly. "No room at all!" the Hare echoed. Alice looked at the dozens of empty chairs. "There's plenty of room," she said calmly, taking a seat. The Hatter stared at her. "Your hair needs cutting," he announced. "That's a very rude thing to say," Alice replied.
Rude, you asked us to fix your hair, didn't you? I did not. And so the tea party began, though calling it a party was perhaps too generous. The conversation hopped about like a nervous rabbit, never staying still for more than a moment. The Hatter asked riddles he didn't know the answers to. The March Hare dipped his pocket watch into his tea. The Dormouse woke up only long enough to tell a story that made no sense before falling asleep again mid-sentence. Every few minutes, the three hosts shouted, "Move down!" and everyone slid one seat to the left, leaving behind dirty dishes without ever cleaning them. Alice tried to understand them. She truly did, but every question she asked only led to more nonsense. Why was a raven like a writing desk? Why was butter used as clock polish? Why was everyone moving down the table constantly? No one could or would explain. Finally, after the Hatter dipped the Dormouse into a teapot to wake him up, which did not work, Alice decided she had had quite enough. She stood, brushed crumbs off her dress, and walked away without a word. Behind her, she heard the Hatter say, "She didn't even thank us." But Alice didn't look back. The forest ahead seemed no less confusing, but at least it was quieter than a mad tea party. And so she continued on, deeper into Wonderland, where stranger adventures were waiting just around the bend. Alice followed the path until it opened into the strangest garden she had ever seen. Bright rose bushes grew everywhere, and gardeners shaped like living playing cards hurried in every direction, splashing paint onto white roses to make them red. Alice blinked. Surely roses did not usually complain while being painted. Before she could ask a question, a trumpet blasted through the garden. "Make way for the Queen!" A long, colorful parade swept in. Soldiers, courtiers, and a procession of cards marching in formation. At the front strode the Queen of Hearts, chin lifted as if the whole universe existed merely to obey her. The Queen spotted Alice at once. "Who is this?" she demanded. Alice curtsied, trying to be polite. "I'm Alice." The Queen frowned, studied her, and then, surprisingly, said, "Very well, come play croquet." Croquet sounded innocent enough. Alice soon discovered it absolutely wasn't. The Queen's croquet ground was chaos. The mallets were flamingos, the balls were hedgehogs, and the arches on the lawn were soldiers bending themselves into shaky tunnels. Every time Alice tried to hit her hedgehog, it curled up and toddled away. Every time she aimed her flamingo, it twisted its neck to stare at her in confusion. Meanwhile, the Queen shrieked, "Off with his head!" about every 2 minutes for reasons Alice couldn't begin to understand. At last, the King of Hearts whispered kindly, "Don't worry, my dear, she never actually executes anyone." This was comforting. Sort of. Then, suddenly, a familiar grin shimmered into view above the croquet field. It floated in midair like a bright crescent moon. The Cheshire Cat. Alice waved. "How are you getting on?" "Quite well, though I can't say the same for that flamingo." Before Alice could reply, the Queen spotted the cat and roared, "Remove that creature!" The executioner refused. The king argued, and the Queen shouted louder and louder until Alice quietly slipped away, leaving them all bickering about whether one could truly behead a creature with no body. As she wandered toward the garden gate, Alice sighed with relief. Of all the wonders in Wonderland, the Queen's croquet game was surely the most exhausting. But her adventure was far from over.
Alice followed the griffin across the sand, the creature's wings flapping lazily as if even the air was too much trouble to push aside. "Come along," the griffin muttered, though not impatiently. "He's been waiting to tell his story all day." "Who has?" Alice asked, brushing wind-blown hair from her face. "The Mock Turtle, of course," said the griffin. "You can't imagine what he's like." Alice tried to imagine, but nothing came to mind except a turtle wearing a sorrowful expression. She soon learned her imagination had actually been quite accurate. The Mock Turtle sat on a rock overlooking the waves, his shell gleaming dull green, his eyes full of ancient sadness, such deep, dramatic sadness that Alice could not help feeling quiet and respectful. "This here is the young lady," the griffin announced. The Mock Turtle heaved a sigh that seemed to drift all the way toward the horizon. "Very well," he murmured. "Let us begin." Alice sat down, folding her hands politely. The griffin settled beside her, tail flicking. "You may not believe it," the Mock Turtle said, "but I was once a real turtle." He paused dramatically. Alice nodded, unsure what response was expected. "I went to school in the sea, a wonderful school, best education available, except it was always conducted by an old turtle we called Tortoise." "Why do you call him Tortoise if he was a turtle?" "Because he taught us," the Mock Turtle said, wounded that she had needed to ask. The griffin snorted with laughter. The Mock Turtle lifted his flippers, describing how the underwater students learned everything from reeling and writhing to ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision. Alice listened with earnest curiosity, even when the subjects made very little sense. The griffin kept interrupting with little snickers and comments, but the Mock Turtle moved on as though performing a grand, tragic recital. "We also had extra lessons," he said solemnly, "drawling, stretching, and fainting in coils." "What was fainting in coils?" asked Alice. "A subject taught by an eel," the griffin said. "Naturally." The stories continued. Lessons, dances, schoolmates, and all manner of odd underwater customs. Though Alice could not tell whether the Mock Turtle was exaggerating or simply confused, she found the whole thing strangely comforting. At last, the Mock Turtle sat back, exhausted but proud. "That," he declared, "is the story of my education." Alice clapped softly, unsure whether applause was proper, but wanting to be polite. The griffin stretched his wings lazily. "Well," he said, "shall we show her the dance?" "Oh, yes," the Mock Turtle said, brightening, "the lobster quadrille." Alice had no idea what that was, but she was beginning to learn that in Wonderland, asking too many questions only made things more confusing. So she simply smiled and said, "I'd like that very much." And with that, the Mock Turtle and griffin prepared to teach her a dance like nothing she had seen before.
Who stole the tarts? When Alice finally stopped shrinking and growing for the moment, she found herself in a grand courtroom shaped like a giant upside-down hat. Everything seemed far too serious for Wonderland, which only made it more ridiculous. At the highest seat sat the King of Hearts, wearing spectacles he clearly didn't need. Beside him sat the Queen, tapping her foot impatiently as though she already wanted someone beheaded, even if she didn't yet know who. "Call the first witness," the White Rabbit announced, blowing a trumpet much too loudly. Alice scanned the room. The jury box was filled with creatures scribbling in little notebooks, mostly doodles, because none of them actually understood what a trial was. In the center was the Knave of Hearts, accused of stealing the Queen's tarts. He looked miserable enough that Alice almost felt sorry for him. The first witness was called, the Hatter. He stumbled in, still wearing his enormous hat, followed by the March Hare and a sleepy dormouse. The king stared at the Hatter, puzzled. "You ought to take off your hat," the king said. "It isn't mine," said the Hatter nervously. "I'm a hatter. I sell them." The queen narrowed her eyes. "Just get on with it." The Hatter tried to explain something about tea time, buttered watches, and how time itself had become offended and refused to move. None of it had anything to do with tarts. The king sighed. "You're wasting time." "If time were here," the Hatter muttered, "he certainly wouldn't appreciate that remark." Before the queen could shout, "Off with his head," the Hatter panicked, grabbed the dormouse, and rushed out of the courtroom. The next witness was the cook. Clouds of pepper followed her like a storm. Every creature in the room sneezed violently. "What are tarts made of?" the king asked. "Pepper," she said. "Certainly not," the queen snapped. "Everyone uses pepper except you," the cook growled and stomped out. By now, the courtroom was as confused as ever. Papers were flying, animals were arguing, and the queen was getting dangerously red in the face. The king shuffled through a stack of letters and poems as if he finally found something important. He waved a sheet of paper triumphantly. "Here it is, a piece of evidence." But the writing made absolutely no sense. The knave insisted he'd never written it, and Alice, who was growing steadily taller again, couldn't help speaking up. "It doesn't prove anything," she said. The king glared. "If you grow any larger, you'll be asked to leave." "I can't help it," Alice replied, suddenly feeling very bold. "You're all being extremely silly." Gasps filled the room. The queen stood furious. "Off with her!" But before she could finish, Alice grew taller and taller until she towered over the entire court. She planted her feet firmly. "You're nothing but a pack of cards!" And as she said it, the creatures began swirling around her like fluttering leaves. The courtroom, the king, the queen, the jury, everything dissolved into a storm of falling cards. And then Alice woke up. But that is for the next chapter. Alice found herself in a courtroom, though, like everything in Wonderland, it was a very strange one. The King and Queen of Hearts sat on their thrones. The Knave of Hearts stood before them as the accused, and all around, curious creatures filled the room. Birds, animals, and even a few playing cards. Alice felt taller again, growing slowly, steadily, without quite knowing why. The White Rabbit called out, "The trial of the Knave of Hearts, who is charged with stealing the Queen's tarts." The first witness was the Hatter, who babbled nervously about tea and time. The Queen glared at him so fiercely that he dropped his teacup and nearly fell over. The next witness, the Duchess's cook, hurled a pan at the jury and stormed away. Then the White Rabbit unrolled a long scroll and announced, "Alice!" Alice blinked. Me? She hadn't expected that at all. She stepped forward confidently. After all, she was nearly her full size again. The king asked, "What do you know about this case?" "Nothing," Alice replied honestly. "That's very important," said the king.
It's not important at all, Alice argued, feeling bolder. The king frowned, flipping through his notes as if trying to find a rule she had broken. Alice only grew taller, so tall the jurors had to crane their necks to see her. Then the White Rabbit read a piece of paper the court had just found. The king and queen leaned forward eagerly. It was a poem. Nonsense, from beginning to end. The queen insisted it proved the knave's guilt immediately. Alice disagreed. "You're all talking nonsense," she declared. The queen's face turned crimson. "Off with her." But Alice didn't let her finish. "You're nothing but a pack of cards." At once, the courtroom erupted. The cards rose into the air and came swirling toward her like a storm. Alice raised her hands to protect herself, and suddenly awoke on the riverbank, her head in her sister's lap. Her sister brushed leaves from Alice's hair and smiled gently. "You've had quite a dream, dear." Alice sat up, the last whispers of Wonderland drifting away like morning mist. She walked home, thinking of the strange friends she'd made and the stories she'd one day tell. And Wonderland, well, it waited quietly, just behind the world she knew.
Alice Between Worlds. In this imagined chapter 13, Alice finds herself drifting away from the chaotic courtroom after the Queen of Hearts orders her execution. Instead of waking up or continuing the trial, she slips into a strange in-between place, a quiet, misty glade that feels halfway between Wonderland and the real world. Here, the noise of the trial fades into whispers. The Cheshire Cat appears, but only as a floating grin at first, slowly revealing himself in pieces. He explains that Alice is between stories, a moment where Wonderland reorders itself before deciding what happens next. As Alice walks deeper into the glade, she meets faint shadows of characters she encountered earlier: the Mad Hatter, the Duchess, the Caterpillar, each flickering like memories. They repeat fragments of advice she heard before, now sounding wiser and more meaningful. Alice begins to question Wonderland itself. Is it nonsense? A dream? A lesson? Or does it simply reflect her own imagination? In the center of the glade stands a tall looking-glass tree. Every leaf acts like a mirror, showing Alice different versions of herself: brave, curious, frightened, hopeful. When she touches one, the entire glade trembles, and she suddenly feels herself growing again. This time, not in size, but in confidence. The Cheshire Cat tells her that only she can choose how her story ends. The Queen's power, he hints, only works on those who believe in it. With that, the glade begins to dissolve into bright white light. Alice steps forward, letting the world around her blur, and finds herself suddenly back in the courtroom, now ready to stand up for herself fully, unafraid of the Queen's threats. This leads smoothly into chapter 14, where Wonderland begins to unravel and Alice finally wakes from the dream.